Paris, November 7th, 1943. The crystal chandeliers of Maxime's cast golden pools across starched white tablecloths, while outside, in the November cold, the city starved in darkness. Camille Beaumont's hands trembled as she poured Chateau d'Yquem into the glass of Oberleutnant Werner von Hoffmann, her wrist angled just so, the way Monsieur Vaudable had taught her before the war, when the restaurant served diplomats and opera singers instead of Wehrmacht officers. The wine caught the light, amber, expensive, obscene. Werner smiled up at her, his pale eyes tracking the curve of her neck, and she felt her stomach contract with a hatred so pure it burned behind her sternum like swallowed acid. She smiled back. She had learned to smile. 3 blocks away, in the unheated apartment on Rue de la Huchette, her sister Sophie lay curled beneath every blanket they owned, her 14-year-old body consuming itself. Juvenile diabetes. The word meant nothing before the war, when insulin came from the pharmacy on Boulevard Saint-Germain in small glass vials with printed labels. Now it meant everything. Now it meant Sophie's fingertips turning blue, her lips cracking, her consciousness drifting in and out like a radio signal lost to static. Werner had what Sophie needed. In the medical warehouses near Place de la République, stacked on German requisition shelves, sat enough insulin to save 100 diabetic children. But the occupiers kept such luxuries for themselves, for their own people, for the favored few who understood the mathematics of survival in wartime. Camille understood those mathematics now. She had calculated them with the precision of a woman who had watched her sister's breath grow shallow. The equation was simple, obscene, and absolute. Sophie's life for Camille's body. But Werner von Hoffmann wanted more than flesh in the darkness. He wanted a trophy. The first time Werner proposed his terms, they stood in the alley behind Maxime's, where the kitchen staff threw out enough food scraps to feed half a neighborhood, if anyone dared scavenge beneath the gaze of German sentries. It was October, nearly 5 weeks earlier. The night air smelled of rain and tobacco. Werner's uniform was perfectly pressed despite the season's coal shortages. Luftwaffe supply officers, Camille had learned, never lacked for anything. "I can help you," he said in careful French, his accent softening the consonants. "The insulin your sister needs. 3 vials? Perhaps 4. Enough for 2 months, maybe 3 if you're careful with the dosage." Camille's heart had lurched. She'd been asking everyone, the pharmacist who sold saccharine and black market aspirin, the doctor who no longer had anesthetic for surgeries, the concierge Madame Dupont who knew everyone's secrets and sorrows. No one had insulin. No one had anything that wasn't marked for German use first, French survival second. "What do you want?" she asked, though she already knew. Women always knew. Werner lit a cigarette, offered her one. She declined. He studied her face in the matchlight. 23 years old, dark hair pinned beneath her service cap, the kind of beauty that Paris had exported in paintings and films before the war taught the city about hunger. "Company," he said. "Your company, dinner, perhaps the opera. You'd wear something elegant. We'd be seen together." The words "be seen" settled between them like a contract written in ice. Camille understood immediately. He didn't want a mistress hidden in an attic room, a shameful transaction conducted in shadow. He wanted a collaborator, a symbol, a French girl on his arm at the Opéra Garnier, proving that France could be tamed, domesticated, made complicit in its own occupation. She thought of Sophie's last conscious words that morning. "Cam, I'm so cold." "Why am I so cold when it's not even winter yet?" "How long?" Camille asked. "As long as I'm stationed in Paris. 6 months, perhaps 8. Who can say? The war might end tomorrow." He smiled. They both knew he was lying. "I'll provide the insulin weekly, a vial at a time, and other things, food, coal for heating. Your sister won't suffer. Neither will you. Neither will you, as if suffering could be divided into such neat categories. As if the girl who wore stolen velvet gowns to German dinners while her neighbors starved would somehow escape suffering's mathematics. But Sophie was 14. Sophie was dying. Sophie was Camille's only family since their parents died in the Exodus of 1940, machine-gunned on the roads south by Stuka dive bombers while they fled with 3 million other Parisians who believed distance from Germans meant safety. Camille took the cigarette from Werner's hand and drew smoke into her lungs. "I'll need the first vial tonight," she said. Werner's smile widened. "Of course. I'm a man of my word." The performance began 3 days later. Werner arrived at Rue de la Huchette in an Opel staff car, the kind reserved for officers of field rank or higher. He climbed the 6 flights to their apartment. No elevator since 1940, when the electrical grid became another German commodity. And he did not comment on the cold or the peeling wallpaper or the rust stains in the sink where water came on Tuesdays and Fridays only. He brought a dress. Camille would remember that dress for the rest of her life. Crimson velvet, probably stolen from some Jewish family's armoire during the July roundups. The fabric whispered against her skin like a secret. It fit perfectly. Werner had guessed her measurements with predatory accuracy. And it transformed her into someone she didn't recognize, someone who looked complicit, someone who looked willing. "Beautiful," Werner said, adjusting the collar. His fingers brushed her collarbone. She forced herself not to flinch. "We're dining at Le Grand Vefour tonight. They've saved venison. Can you imagine? Venison in Paris in 1943. Yes, Camille could imagine, while children in Belleville ate rutabaga soup stretched with water until it tasted like slightly dirty nothing. German officers dined on venison in restaurants where the waiters still wore white gloves and bowed from the waist. In the bedroom, Sophie lay propped on pillows, her first insulin dose administered 3 days earlier, her color already marginally better. She watched Camille in the doorway, watched her sister in crimson velvet on the arm of a German, and her 14-year-old eyes held a knowledge no child should possess. "You look pretty, Cam," Sophie whispered. Camille couldn't speak. If she spoke, she would scream, and if she screamed, the performance would end. And if the performance ended, Sophie would die. So she smiled instead, blew Sophie a kiss, and followed Werner von Hoffmann down 6 flights of stairs to his Opel, where the driver held the door open like she was something valuable. Le Grand Vefour occupied the arcades of Palais Royal, its mirrors reflecting 200 years of French power and pretense. Tonight it reflected the occupation's hierarchy: Wehrmacht colonels, Gestapo officers in civilian suits, French industrialists who'd gotten rich selling steel and coal to the Reich, and German officers with French women who'd made different calculations. Werner guided Camille through the tables with his hand on her lower back, proprietary, performative. Eyes followed them. She felt each gaze like a physical touch, assessing, judging, cataloging her complicity. At a corner table, Werner ordered for both of them in German. The waiter nodded obsequiously. The food arrived in portions that would have fed Sophie for 3 days: venison in wine sauce, roasted potatoes swimming in butter, green beans that must have cost a week's wages on the black market. "Eat," Werner said. "You're too thin." Camille picked up her fork. The meat was tender, obscene. She thought of Madame Dupont downstairs, 68 years old, trying to survive on the official ration of 3 ounces of meat per week. She thought of the children at the Père Blanc soup kitchen, their legs bowed from rickets. She thought of Sophie, whose body had been eating itself from the inside. She took a bite. Then another. Survival, she was learning, tasted like complicity. Werner talked throughout dinner about his hometown near Stuttgart, about his engineering studies before the war, about his belief that France and Germany shared a civilized future if only the right people cooperated. He used the word cooperation 7 times. Each time it sounded like a threat wrapped in philosophy. "You understand, don't you, Camille? This arrangement benefits everyone. Your sister lives. You're protected. I have companionship in a foreign city." He reached across the table, took her hand. His skin was warm, well-fed. "We're not monsters. We're just men trying to survive this war, same as you." Camille looked at their joined hands, his manicured, clean, hers red from washing dishes in cold water without soap, and felt a hatred so intense it was almost transcendent. But she squeezed his fingers gently and said, "Yes, I understand." She understood perfectly. She understood that he needed her complicity more than her body. He needed her to sit here in crimson velvet, eating venison, smiling. He needed her to prove that occupation could become collaboration, that France could be seduced rather than simply conquered. And she was giving him exactly that, because Sophie was 14 and dying, and sisters didn't get the luxury of refusing. The performance became routine. Every Wednesday and Saturday, Werner arrived with insulin in his coat pocket and expectations in his pale eyes. Sometimes they dined at Maxime's, where Camille's co-workers served them with faces carefully blank. Sometimes the Opéra Garnier, where German officers and collaborationist officials applauded Verdi in a building that smelled of perfume and pretense. Sometimes simply a walk through the Tuileries, Werner's arm through hers, making her visible to all of occupied Paris. The stares grew worse. In November, it was curiosity mixed with contempt. By December, it hardened into hatred. Women who'd known Camille since childhood crossed the street to avoid her. The baker on Rue de Seine refused to sell her bread, even though she had ration cards. Someone painted "whore" on their apartment door in black paint. Madame Dupont scrubbed it off with turpentine and never mentioned it, but her eyes when she looked at Camille held something complex. Not quite sympathy, not quite condemnation, something that recognized survival's mathematics. Camille learned to navigate Paris with her eyes down. She learned to ignore the whispers that followed her like a second shadow. Collabo, Boche lover, horizontal collaborator. The words were French, but they sounded like German, harsh, angular, cutting. Werner seemed oblivious, or perhaps he simply didn't care. To him, the stares were confirmation of his conquest. Look, they seemed to say, even French women prefer German winners. But in the apartment on Rue de la Huchette, Camille performed a different mathematics. The insulin kept Sophie alive, but the food Werner provided, real food, not rutabaga and sawdust bread, she divided differently. Part for Sophie, part for herself, because starvation made you too weak to hate, and Camille needed her hatred sharp and pure. And part she wrapped in newspaper and left outside Madame Dupont's door after midnight. Tins of German beef, packages of real butter, occasionally vegetables that hadn't been frost-damaged or picked over. She never signed these packages. She never acknowledged them. But Madame Dupont stopped scrubbing the door quite so vigorously when the paint appeared a second time, a third time. And when Camille passed her in the hall, the old woman's eyes held something that might have been understanding. The intimate scenes with Werner unfolded with a mechanical precision that Camille perfected over months. He would arrive at the apartment after their public performances, sometimes reeking of cognac and cigarettes, sometimes showered and cologne-scented. He never asked permission. The arrangement implied permission. In bed, Camille learned to separate herself from her body. She would fix her eyes on the ceiling crack that looked like a river delta, or count the water stains forming archipelagos across the plaster, or recite poetry in her head. Rimbaud, Baudelaire, anyone who'd written about Paris before the occupation turned the city into a transaction. Werner wasn't violent. That somehow made it worse. He was tender, considerate, the kind of lover who asked, "Is this good?" and waited for affirmation. Camille learned to give that affirmation, to perform pleasure with the same precision she performed companionship. She learned to make the sounds he wanted to hear, to arch her back at the right moments, to whisper, "Yes," when her mind screamed, "No, no, no, never, never, never." Afterward, Werner would smoke and talk about Stuttgart, about the house his family owned near the Neckar River, about bringing Camille there after the war to meet his mother. He spoke as if France had already surrendered not just militarily, but spiritually, as if Camille's presence in his bed meant she'd chosen Germany's future over France's past. She never corrected him. Correction cost insulin. But in the darkness, with Werner's breathing settling into sleep, and Sophie's thin form visible through the bedroom doorway, Camille would lie awake and catalog her hatred. She memorized every detail of Werner's face, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his hairline receded slightly at the temples, the particular blue of his eyes that looked almost kind in certain light. She memorized these details the way a prosecutor memorizes evidence, storing them for a future reckoning she couldn't yet imagine, but knew would come. Because occupations didn't last forever. History was a wheel, not a straight line. And Camille understood, with an intuition born of survival, that someday the wheel would turn and she would be the one who paid for Sophie's survival. She accepted this. She would pay any price. But she would remember exactly what she'd purchased. Spring 1944 brought rumors. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Red Army was pushing westward. At Maxim's, German officers began drinking more heavily. Their laughter pitched higher, more desperate. Werner became tense, distracted. His visits grew more frequent but shorter, as if he needed to extract whatever he could before time ran out. In June, the Allies landed in Normandy. The news came in whispers, in coded phrases, in the sudden animation of Parisians' faces when Germans weren't watching. Liberation wasn't abstract anymore. It was coming, inevitable as autumn. Werner felt it too. His tenderness acquired an edge of desperation. He brought Camille more gifts, stolen jewelry, French perfume looted from Jewish apartments, a fur coat that still had someone else's name sewn into the lining. He talked more insistently about Stuttgart, about the future, about how Camille should come with him when his unit withdrew. "You'll be a pariah here," he said one night in July, his uniform jacket thrown over a chair, his face vulnerable in the candlelight. Electricity had become sporadic even in German requisitioned apartments. "The French will need someone to blame for their own cooperation. Women like you, visible women, you'll be targets." Camille said nothing. She already knew this. The mathematics were clear. "Come with me," Werner pressed. "My mother would accept you. We could marry. You'd be safe." Safe. The word was absurd. But Camille performed consideration, let him believe she was weighing options, calculating futures. In reality, she was calculating how long Sophie's insulin stockpile would last after Werner left, how many vials she'd need to steal before the end. She stole 6 vials in late July, hidden in her handbag, when Werner brought her to the warehouse to show her where the medicine came from. It was a test, she realized later. Would she steal from him? Could he trust her complicity? She passed the test by stealing so subtly he never noticed, but she failed the test he hadn't articulated. She would never leave Paris. She would never become Frau von Hoffmann in Stuttgart. She was French, not because of nationalism or patriotism, but because Sophie was French, and Camille's entire existence had narrowed to Sophie's survival in their 6th-floor apartment in the city their parents died trying to leave. August 24th, 1944. The date would become sacred to Paris. Liberation Day. But for Camille, it began with Werner's knock at 3 a.m., sharp and urgent. He was in full uniform, a duffel bag over his shoulder. His face was pale, older suddenly. "I'm leaving," he said. "The Allies will be here by noon, maybe sooner." He pressed a thick envelope into her hands. Reichsmarks, thousands of them, neat and useless. "Buy yourself time," he said. "Find somewhere to hide until—" "Until what?" Camille asked. Her voice was flat, empty. She'd spent 9 months performing for this man, and now she couldn't summon even theatrical emotion. Werner looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. "For your sister. I understand that. I hope others will understand too." He kissed her forehead, tender, brotherly, obscene, and left. Camille stood in the doorway holding worthless German money and watched him descend 6 flights of stairs for the last time. She felt nothing. Hatred required energy, and she had none left. Sophie called from the bedroom. Cam? What's happening? We're going to be all right, Camille said. She believed it for approximately 6 hours. The knock came at 9 a.m. Not Werner's civilized tap, but a fist against wood, demanding, violent. Camille was mixing Sophie's insulin when she heard it. Her hands froze. She knew instantly and completely what was coming. "Sophie," she said, her voice very calm. "Get in the wardrobe, now. Take your insulin. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" Sophie's eyes were huge. 14 years old, 15 now. Her birthday had passed in June, old enough to understand. Now, please." Sophie crawled into the wardrobe among their winter coats and pre-war dresses that no longer fit. Camille closed the door gently, then turned to face her own door as it splintered open. The mob poured in. Neighbors, strangers, people she'd seen at the market and people she'd never met. At the front was Madame Dupont, her face twisted with a rage that looked performative, necessary. Their eyes met for 1 second. In that second, Camille understood. Madame Dupont was saving herself. The woman who'd eaten Camille's stolen German beef now needed to prove her resistance credentials by leading the charge against a collaborator. Camille felt a laugh building in her chest, hysterical, absurd, but swallowed it down. "Collabo!" someone shouted. "Whore!" Hands grabbed her, pulled her from the apartment. She didn't resist. Resistance would draw attention to the wardrobe, to Sophie hidden among coats. So she let them drag her down 6 flights of stairs, through the lobby where she'd lived since 1938, out into the August sunshine of Rue de la Huchette. The courtyard was full, more neighbors, people from other buildings. Photographers with cameras, American, she thought distantly, or British. Come to document French retribution. Someone produced garden shears, the blades rough and uneven. They pushed her into a chair in the center of the courtyard. Purification, someone shouted. Epuration. The shears were cold against her scalp. Chunks of dark hair fell into her lap onto the cobblestones. Camille kept her eyes fixed on the 6th-floor window of her apartment, on the wardrobe where Sophie was hidden. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she'd surrendered 9 months ago in the alley behind Maxime's. They stripped her to her slip. Not for efficiency, but for humiliation. Someone produced grease paint, the kind used in theaters. They painted a swastika on her bare chest, black and stark and indelible. "March," they commanded. So Camille marched, through the streets of Paris in her slip and shorn head, flanked by her neighbors turned executioners. The photographers followed, their cameras clicking. She would be in newspapers tomorrow, one more image of justice served, one more warning to women who'd made survival calculations in the mathematics of occupation. People lined the route, cheering, spitting, throwing vegetables saved from their rations specifically for this purpose. Camille walked with her head up, her eyes forward. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. What was there to explain? That Sophie was alive? That Sophie had turned 15 in June? That every vial of insulin required Camille to perform desire for a man she despised with such purity it had become almost holy? There was nothing to explain. The world dealt in surfaces, in symbols, in simple narratives of guilt and innocence. Camille wore crimson velvet to German dinners. Therefore Camille was guilty. The mathematics were different now, but no less absolute. After 2 hours, they returned her to Rue de la Huchette. The crowd dispersed, their bloodlust satisfied. Camille climbed 6 flights in her slip, her chest still marked with black grease paint that would take weeks to fully wash away. She opened the wardrobe. Sophie fell into her arms, sobbing. Cam, they said you were—" "I'm here," Camille whispered into her sister's hair. "I'm here. You're alive. That's all that matters." And it was. God help her, it was. Paris forgot quickly. By September, there were new villains to punish: Vichy officials, French SS volunteers, actual Gestapo collaborators. Women who'd slept with Germans became old news. Camille's hair grew back, darker at the roots. The swastika faded to a shadow, then disappeared entirely. But something in her had cauterized. The girl who poured wine at Maxime's before the war, who believed in dignity and choice, and the luxury of moral purity. That girl died in 9 months of crimson velvet and stolen insulin. The woman who replaced her understood that survival was always a transaction, always painful, always more complex than the stories people told themselves afterward. Sophie lived. She survived the war, married a lawyer from Lyon in 1951, had 3 children who never quite understood why their mother kept such obsessive medical records, why she stockpiled insulin long after supply chains stabilized. Camille never married. She returned to restaurant work, eventually became manager of a bistro in the Marais. She never spoke about the occupation, never corrected the stories people told about horizontal collaborators at dinner parties, never explained the mathematics that made some prices worth paying. But sometimes late at night she would stand at her apartment window, a different apartment now in a different arrondissement, and look out at Paris. The city had forgotten the starvation, the darkness, the impossible choices. The city remembered liberation, resistance, redemption, simple narratives for complex survival. Camille remembered differently. She remembered Werner's pale eyes and Sophie's shallow breathing and the weight of crimson velvet against her skin. She remembered Madame Dupont leading the mob and the garden shears against her scalp and the absolute clarity of her choice. Sophie's life, always, at any cost. History would judge her, already had judged her. But history wasn't in that wardrobe on August 24th, hearing her sister's breathing through the door while strangers painted symbols of collaboration on her chest. History didn't get to decide what prices were worth paying. Only the women who paid them did. And Camille would make the same choice again in every possible lifetime, in every possible war. Sophie lived. In the end, in the beginning, in every moment between, that was the only mathematics that mattered. The velvet had been stolen. The insulin had been German. The body and the bed had been hers to sacrifice. And Sophie was alive. Everything else was commentary.